All right, guys. So I should be live, hopefully. So, weird title, funny story, and that is something that I'm going to have to be explaining as I continue this video. So, as you know, if you've been following this channel for a while, I love science. That's why the name of the channel is called Science Enthusiast. I'm a former science teacher, formerly taught in physics by a physicist, a good friend of mine's. Shout out to Sentinel Apologetics. Um, Rob actually helped me get my first job as a science teacher. Shout out to Rob from Sentinel Apologetics. Love you, bro. Um, so that is one aspect of my YouTube channel is science education, and showing people that you can believe in God, you can believe in Jesus, and you can be scientifically literate. So that's amazing. The second aspect of my YouTube channel is understanding that there isn't any modern science in the Bible. So that's where my mentor and friend Rob and I would disagree. Um, so I don't think that there's any science in the Bible. Rob would say that there isn't a lot of people who don't study the Bible from what's called an ancient or Eastern perspective would say that there is science in the Bible. I think it comes from a misunderstanding of what's going on in the text. But long story short, before I get into this topic, I have to explain my reasons for why I'm saying what I'm saying. It might sound weird, it might sound strange, but hear me out. The Bible was written in a certain place at a certain time to a specific people who lived 3,000 years ago. That is very far away from 2022. And so much has changed in 3,000 years. So, a lot of things in the biblical text that we might think is science is actually talking about something completely different, just because certain words and meanings of words have changed and cultures have evolved. So when we look at particular things in the biblical text, we usually get them wrong. So with that being said, when we look at the miracles, let's say of Jesus, through a scientific modern lens today, we are not understanding the miracles of Jesus in its cultural perspective. We need to understand the miracles of Jesus from a first century Greco Roman perspective, because Jesus lived in Jerusalem while Jerusalem was under the Roman rule. That's called the Pax Romana time period. And also, we need to understand Jesus' miracles from a first century Jewish perspective. And we also need to understand Jesus' miracles from a second temple Jewish perspective, because Jesus lived in the time period of the second temple. So we have to understand the life of Jesus and the claims of Jesus and the life of Jesus and the miracles of Jesus from a ancient Near Eastern perspective. When we look at the text from a Western perspective, we'll get it wrong every single time, and we'll miss key factors and key points that we shouldn't miss. So this video today is going to be talking about why in the first century did people relate Jesus to being a magician. It might be silly to us, it might sound crazy to us, but there is a method to my madness and what I'm going to show you in this video. This will be probably one of the strangest videos you ever have watched in your life. But if you stay tuned to the end, it will be a blessing. And hopefully it helps strengthen your relationship in the God of Israel, the God of Jesus, who is my God and your God. And hopefully this will strengthen your faith, and it'll make everything all make sense. So let me share my screen. Okay. So we have to understand magic in the first century world. In our eyes today, magic means something different than what it meant in the ancient world. So let me read from the article. This is from BibleOdyssey.org. They have some pretty good reputable articles on there. And obviously, you guys know this channel. I wouldn't be using it if they didn't. Magic is a notoriously sticky term. Originally, the Greek term magi or magi, or I think it's actually pronounced magia. The Greek term magia was referred to the religion of the magi, Persian Zoroastrian priests, and by extension to any religious ritual that seemed alien and exotic from a Greek or Roman perspective. But magia was just one of several derogatory terms used in Greek and Latin for suspicious, dangerous, or fraudulent religious practices and rituals. The Jewish world had another set of terms, most fully listed in Deuteronomy 18:10-11. But when it came to what was magic and what was not, the designation depended as much on whom you asked as on what it actually was or who practiced it. In the sense, or in this sense, in the first century Common Era, what some observers saw as magic could be seen by others as religion or medicine. So it depends on who viewed the miracle. It completely depends. It was not completely one way or the other. In John 9:6, Jesus heals a blind man by mixing mud with spittle and anointing the man's eyes. Is this magic, medicine, or healing? Whatever we call it, this was a familiar procedure for first century Jews and very close to the actions once taken by the likes of the prophets Elijah and Elisha when they performed their miraculous healings. Some Jews were quite proud of Jewish expertise in healings and exorcisms. The apocryphal book of Tobit tells a story about the miraculous healing of a blind man by blowing the gall of a fish into his eyes, as recommended by the angel Raphael, whose name literally means God has healed. And the Jewish historian, Josephus reports that he once saw a Jewish exorcist healing demonics in the presence of the Roman emperor himself. But other Jews and many non-Jews looked down upon such practices, condemning them as magic and superstition. The Jewish philosopher Philo distinguished the highbrow magic of Zoroastrian priests from the lowbrow quackery practiced by women and slaves. Stories of the wonders supposedly performed by various miracle mongers who claimed to heal people through means that made no medical sense whatsoever provided great comic fodder for Lucian, a Syrian Greek writer of satire. So to skip down to the below, to return to Jesus' miracles, or to return to Jesus' miracle healing in John 9:6, what his followers would have seen as miraculous demonstration of his divine powers could easily be construed by Jewish and non-Jewish opponents as a clear example of Jesus' recourse to crass magical practices. In fact, we have some of the writings from these opponents. The pagan philosopher Celsus condemns Jesus as a sort of inferior magician, as does an ancient Jewish text known as Toledoth Yeshu, or The History of Jesus, an Aramaic collection of nasty stories about Jesus and his early followers that circulated in the early Middle Ages. So you're starting to see that when it came to the God of Israel, and when it came to Jesus, and when it came to the New Testament and things like that, there isn't really a very big distinction between magic. I'll tell you now, the only differentiator, or the only thing that differentiated good magic from bad magic, or the power of God from what we would call witchcraft today, the only thing that distinguished the two really is that God was in control of his miracles. And if a person or an Israelite or somebody from another nation use these magical practices outside of the confines of the God of Israel, that would be considered witchcraft or paganism. So there really wasn't any big distinction except for the fact that you're using your God and I'm using my God. Let's see which God is more powerful. That was pretty much the only distinction literally in the ancient world. And that's to just save some time from these different tabs. That usually, or that really is the difference. So on Cold Case Christianity's website, this is a website by J. Warner Wallace. I love his website. It's really good. He actually has a article on the existence of Jesus. Did Jesus exist? And what's the historical evidence for Jesus outside the Bible? So he actually collects some of these texts from these historians that say Jesus had magical powers. Now, this is what he says, or this is what he records. So this is from Celsus. This was the guy I talked about in the other article. Now, listen to what he says about Jesus. Jesus had come from a village in Judea and was the son of a poor Jewess who gained her living by the work of her own hands. His mother had been turned out of doors by her husband, who was a carpenter by trade, on being convicted of adultery with a soldier named Panthera. Being thus driven away by her husband and wandering about in disgrace, she gave birth to Jesus, a bastard. Jesus, on account of his poverty, was hired out to go to Egypt. While there, he acquired certain magical powers, which Egyptians pride themselves on possessing. He returned home highly elated at possessing these powers. On the strength of them, gave himself out to be a god. Now, Celsus, as you can see, he's a non-Christian. He doesn't believe in Jesus. He has some very nasty things to say about Jesus. But he admits that Jesus was a miracle worker, that Jesus had miraculous abilities, that Jesus had magic powers that made him out to be a god. Now, there's a reason why historians in the first century are saying this. There's a reason. Now, there's another text from the Jewish Talmud. Jesus practiced magic and led Israel astray. This is from Sanhedrin B 43a. So you can see that these people are not a fan. These people are not a fan of Jesus, but they're admitting to Jesus having magical abilities, Jesus having miraculous powers. There's a reason why. And this is one of the reasons why. Magic and religion. So in the ancient world, they actually had categories per se of magic. Now, there was a guy, his name is Sir James George Fraser. In the 1800s, he figured this out and he coined these terms sympathetic magic and contagious magic. And he realized that these were two categories of magic that people in the ancient world believed in. So let's read a little bit about sympathetic magic. For those who believe that magic is an effective method for causing supernatural actions, there are two major ways in which the commonly believed to occur: sympathy and contagion. Sympathetic magic. Sympathetic magic is based on the principle that like produces like. By the way, Sir James George Fraser, one of the ways he found this out is through looking at surrounding nations around Israel, like the Canaanites. And he figured out from looking at Canaanite texts what was going on in the Hebrew Bible. And we know that the Israelites are former Canaanites. There's been scholarship and studies out about that. You can kind of figure it out on your own from the Bible. But we know that the Israelites were former Canaanites. And even if you disagree with that, we know that the Israelites and the Canaanites were neighbors and that they fought against each other and that they would have been familiar with each other's rituals and each other's practices and each other's customs. So Sir James George Fraser, he put two and two together, and you have these rituals in these Canaanite texts that allude to this idea that is this principle called like produces like. So, for instance, whatever happens to an image of someone will also happen to them. This is the basis for use of voodoo dolls in the folk tradition of Haiti. If someone sticks a pin into the stomach of the doll, the person of whom it is a likeness will be expected to experience a simultaneous pain in his or her stomach. Sympathetic magic is also referred to as imitative magic. Contagious magic. Contagious magic is based on the principle that things or persons once in contact can afterward influence each other. In other words, it is believed that there is a permanent relationship between an individual and any part of his or her body. As a consequence, believers must take special precautions with their hair, fingernails, teeth, clothes, and feces. If anyone obtained these objects, magic could be performed on them, which would cause the person they came from to be affected. For instance, someone could use your fingernail clippings in a magical ritual that would cause you to love them or fall ill and die. So you have sympathetic magic and contagious magic. And we're going to dig deeper into that in the biblical text, but I'm going to read from these sources a little bit more so you can get an idea of what this actually is talking about. So this is from Sir James George Fraser's book, The Golden Bow. Thus, we have been considering chiefly that branch of sympathetic magic, which may be called homeopathic or imitative. Its leading principle, as we have seen, is that like produces like, or in other words, that an effect resembles its cause. Then you have contagious magic. So the other great branch of sympathetic magic, which I have called contagious magic, proceeds upon the notion that things which have once been conjoined must remain ever afterwards, even when quite disaversed from each other, in such a sympathetic relation that whatever is done to the one must similarly affect the other. So he goes more into that in his book. I just wanted to read directly from the actual source itself because from Sir James George Fraser's research, that gave us this insight into the ancient world. And this is from the 1800s, 1854. So from this text, you have this basically this saying from this Jewish doctor. I'm going to read from here. So at first, this isn't going to make sense, but if you let me read further, when I read further, you'll see how it does make sense. If familiarity with magic was previously associated with curiosities lacking real value, it now seems generally agreed that knowledge of magic in the past is but one aspect of knowledge of religion and also of the society in which magic is investigated. This condition also applies to magic in the world of the Talmudic sages. Talmudic sages are the Jews, the rabbis. A broad culture of many years with many receptors for magic. One of the questions that have occupied investigators for over a century is to what extent were the sages of the Mishnah and Talmud participants in magic activity, and was there a gap between religion and magic and antiquity? The thrust of the following treatment is to add to this subject the investigation of the Jewish religion in antiquity by focusing on textual analysis and methodological examination of the problems facing the students of the sources. A few years ago, an article was published claiming to survey Jewish magic in the period of the Mishnah and Talmud, and viewing it, among other things, through its parallelism to Hellenistic magic. So I'm going to skip a little bit further down so we can just get to the gist of this. There we go. Cure of a dog bite through a dog. This is what I wanted to get to. So basically, you have this thing where, let me see if I can find it. Yep. You have this idea where, in any case, especially important, is the second medical incident mentioned one bitten by a mad dog. For it is a clear example of sympathetic magic medicine and the use of magic in the daily life of sages of the oral law. Mattia ben Haresh was exiled from Palestine to Rome. Later, Midrashim relate that he performed miracles and was cured miraculously over overcoming Satan and conducted a dialogue with the angel Raphael. We just read about the angel Raphael. The Lord minister cures. This is not the place to deal with the historicity of this wonderful miracle story and the remarkable personality of our Mattia ben Haresh. The important point is that the wise man, hold on, here we go, is that the wise man who knew how to cure a person bitten by a mad dog was one who was intimate with the angels and was cured by them. What is important for us to, according to this Tana, we are dealing with the cure of like by like. The patient was hurt by a dog, so the cure is by the same dog. So you have this idea of like produces like. If you are bitten by a dog, then it is that same dog that must cure you. Like produces like. And you have that in Canaanite magic, Haitian magic, voodoo dolls. So you have this continuing idea of a reflection. There's this reflection, there's this like produces like. And so you have that in the Old Testament. So and you have it in the New Testament as well. Now, here's one last thing. So, this is a book that is titled War as Power in the Ancient Near East. And this book, or is this a paper? I think this is actually a paper. There's no table of content. I think this is a paper. Yeah, Boston College. And there is this weird idea that we kind of have a concept of here in today's world. You usually hear people say that God can do anything by his word and God's word has power and blah, blah, blah. But 21st century meatheads don't know what that's actually talking about. We don't really have a clue of what that's really talking about. And this paper goes into that. So I want to read from this paper a little bit, and then I'm going to show the parallels in the Old and New Testament so you can see this from fresh eyes and actually understand what you are reading. Okay, so we talked about magic, we talked about spells, etc., like that. Okay, so let me read from this. The Bible no longer stands alone as witness to this concept, the concept of the word is power, right? So, as a matter of fact, I want to start from something that's not born. As Aristotle noted, man is a being of the word, and it is the spoken and written word that signifies man's preeminence amidst the silence of the plant word and the cacophony of sentient life. A common theme in the ancient Near East is the power of the word. The evidence is now clear that the OT or Old Testament is but one of many ancient witnesses to the theme of the word endowed with power. The Bible no longer stands alone as a witness to this concept. In fact, the Old Testament inherited with only slight modifications this dynamic notion of the efficacious, I think that's how you pronounce the word, the efficacious word, applying it according to its own theological needs within the limits of its orthodoxy. Remember, I said Israel didn't live in a bubble. Israel used concepts that everybody in that surrounding nation or everybody in that surrounding ancient Near Eastern world used. Israel didn't live in a bubble. Israel used terms and phrases from their culture, just like we do today. Hypostatization of the divine word, for example, played little or no part in the Old Testament. Whatever may have been its extraordinary development in the New Testament, it seems that at the very beginning, a magical significance was attached to the word in the ancient world. Pronounced under the right circumstances, this word was thought to have irresistible power for good or evil. Studies in comparative religion provide countless examples of the word conceived as magical power by which men could gain some control over their let me see, their precarious environment. The spells, rituals, and exer- execrations were so many techniques by which results were achieved. We, who make an essential distinction between an action and a formula right or symbol act, find it hard to understand the mentality of people for whom such distinctions had little or no meaning. What did I just say? To us today, we see magic as bad, and God doesn't use magic. God uses the power of miracles. There was no distinction like that in the ancient world. There was no, my God uses miracles and your God uses magic. It was all the same. The only difference is the power or the magic of my God more powerful than your God? And when I say magic, I don't mean magic in the sense that we think of magic today. When I say magic, I mean very ancient, very old, and not in the way how we see magic in 2022. So yeah, they felt no distinction between an action forming the right and symbolic act. We find it hard to understand the mentality of people for whom such distinctions had little or no meaning, since symbol and reality coalesced. Now, this is the meats and potatoes. When the gods of Mesopotamia had conferred kingship among or upon one of their number, Marduk, they wanted assurance that Marduk's word really had that magical power which brought results. If you guys don't know, Marduk in the ancient world was Baal, but the Babylonians changed his name from Baal to Marduk because they didn't want anybody else to know Baal's name. Because in the ancient world, they had an idea, like I said in a previous video before, that if you knew somebody's name, you could have power over them by invoking or using their name or saying or speaking, uttering their name, and it would give you power over that person or over that god. So they changed the name of their god from Baal to Marduk so that nobody would know the divine name of their god. So Marduk, they wanted assurance. So these gods of Mesopotamia, when they were trying to figure out who they wanted to be king, they wanted assurance that Marduk's word really had that magical power, which brought results. They devised a test. They placed a garment in their midst and said to Marduk, their firstborn, O Lord, thy lot is truly highest among the gods. Command annihilation and existence. May both come true. May thy spoken word destroy the garment, then speak again, and may it be intact. He spoke, and at his word, the garment was destroyed. He spoke again, the garment reappeared. The gods, his fathers, seeing the power of his word, rejoiced, paid homage. Marduk is king. So you're starting to see where the Israelites get this idea that God, through his word, creates the world and he does miracles through his word, in the same way that Marduk uses the power of his word so that he can do these miraculous magical abilities. You're starting to see the parallel. The Israelites didn't just make this up, and these ideas didn't just drop out of a hat. They're coming from somewhere, they're coming from a culture, they're coming from a context. This isn't just coming from the sky. Okay. In Sumerian culture, the basis of Mesopotamian civilization, the dogma of the divine word as creative power became firmly established. All that the creating deity had to do, according to this doctrine, was to lay his plans, utter the word. Actually, that word utterance. There's a relationship between utterance and prophecy, because oracles would utter the word of a god, and the oracles or the prophets would utter prophecies, visions about the future to the people. And Israel is no different. Utter the word, and pronounce the name. Let me reread that one more time. All that the creating deity had to do, according to this doctrine, was to lay his plans, utter the word, and pronounce the name. This notion of the creative power of the divine word was probably also the result of an analogical inference based on observation of human society. Well, obviously, it is, right? If a human king could achieve almost all that he wanted by command, by no more than what seemed to be the words of his mouth, how much more was possible for the immortal and superhuman deities in charge of the four realms of the universe? But perhaps the easy solution of the cosmological problems in which thought and word alone are so important is largely a reflection of the drive to escape and to hopeful wish fulfillment characteristics and etc. So that goes into anything. They really should have ended it right here. So what they're saying is this idea that a God could do something by his word, this probably originated from humans sociologically seeing that if a king can get things done just from his decree, then the gods who are kings in the heavens, they also must be able to get even more done from their decree and from their word. So let's go to the biblical text. Okay. I'm going to make sure my screen is sharing because I want to get all of this. Okay. So here we go. Here's the biblical text now. So when you go to 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 30. So at verse 32, we have this scene where Elijah comes to a house and he sees a child that's lying dead on his bed and he shuts the door behind him. And I'm just going to read. So in our modern 2022 worldview, we don't know what's going on. But now that we have this context, we can apply this context to the text. We can understand the cultural assumptions and the cultural concepts, and then we can connect the dots. When Elisha came into the house, he saw the child lying dead on his bed. So he went in and shut the door behind the two of them and prayed to the Lord. Then he went up and lay on the child, putting his mouth on his mouth, his eyes on his eyes, and his hands on his hands. Remember, like produces like. And as he stretched himself upon him, the flesh of the child became warm. Then he got up again and walked once back and forth in the house, and went up and stretched himself upon the child. The child sneezed 7 times, and the child opened his eyes. Then he summoned Gehazi and called to Shimulate. So basically, that's the end of the story. So Elisha brings this little boy back from the dead by putting his body in his body, putting his eyes on his eyes, his mouth on his mouth, his hands on his hands. And the little boy comes back from the dead. Somebody who is living puts himself on somebody who is dead, and that dead person becomes like the person who is alive. That is in your Old Testament text. In all respects and purposes, this is a ritual. This is a magical act, but it's not bad. Like I said, the distinguishing factor in the mind of the Israelite isn't the fact that this is magic in of itself. The thing that distinguishes this to an Israelite is that this is the power of Yahweh. This is the power of the God of Israel. And this is not the power of a pagan deity God. And without that context I just read to you, I would honestly say about 99% of people would not know what's going on in their Bible. We have the story in Matthew chapter 9:21, right? And Jesus rose and followed him. Scroll down a little bit. Sorry about that. And Jesus rose and followed him with his disciples. And behold, a woman who had suffered from a discharge of blood for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment. By the way, when it says this woman had a discharge of blood, just to save time, she had a period that wouldn't stop. So this woman was dealing with issues of menstrual cycle. So this woman had a menstrual cycle that wouldn't stop. So she touches the fringe of Jesus' garment, verse 21. For she said to herself, if I touch, or if I only touch his garment, I will be made well. Jesus turned and seeing her, he said, take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well. And instantly the woman was made well. You also had this idea that was a part of sympathetic magic, which was called transference. As a matter of fact, I'm going to look this up real quick because I want to give you guys a source on this. It should be. This is I think I brought this up before. Second Kings chapter 6, verse 6. So let me take you guys there real quick. So you guys can get a better understanding of what happened in this story. And a lot of these things, they actually happen in the Old Testament first, and then you'll see them in the New Testament later, because the New Testament writers are not doing anything different necessarily. They're drawn from the Tanakh. So this is Second Kings chapter 6. I'm going to bring up some commentary from the NIV Cultural Study Bible by Craig Keener and Dr. John Walton. And says Second Kings 6, verse 6. There we go. So this is the story, right? So the story goes like this. Now the sons of the prophet said to Elisha, see, the place where we dwell under your charge is too small for us. Let us go to the Jordan, and each of us get there a log, and let us make a place for us to dwell there. And he answered, go. Then one of them said, be pleased to go with your servants. And he answered, I will go. So he went with them. This is talking about Elijah. So he went with them. And when they came to the Jordan, they cut down trees. But as one was felling a log, his axe head fell into the water. And he cried out, alas, my master, it was borrowed. Meaning like he got this on a loan. I got to get his back. Then the man of God said, where did it fall? When he showed him the place, he cut off a stick and threw it in there and made the iron float. And he said, take it up. So he reached out his hand and took it. So you had this thing where Elijah and his disciples, they're felling logs, they're cutting logs. One of the disciples, his axe head falls off of his stick. It falls into the Jordan River. He says, hey, I need you to get this for me, Elijah. Elijah throws a stick into the water. The axe head floats up to the top. Also, too, a lot of times in Second Kings and First Kings, you see Elijah being referred to as the man of God. And when you go to church and you hear people call a pastor the man of God or somebody man of God, we get that from the Old Testament. Once again, this is not something that dropped out of the sky. We're getting this from somewhere. This is pulling from somewhere. So this is what my NIV Cultural Study Bible says. Ancient magic included a category called transference, where properties or characteristics of one object were passed to another. In this case, the buoyancy of the wood is passed to the axe head, while the text is unclear whether Elisha was actually practicing magic or not. His actions would have appeared that way to an ancient observer. Because in the ancient world, like I just said, there was no distinction. Is this good magic, bad magic, evil magic? No, 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 no. Is this person using the power of Yahweh, or is this person using the power of another God? And when he throws that stick into the water and the axe head floats up, you have this idea of transference, and you have that principle that we talked about called like produces like. You see this all throughout the text when people are doing miracles and when miraculous things are happening. This is the mindset. This is the mechanics of how these things work, according to what the Israelites would say is the unseen or the supernatural world. So when you see that story in the Gospels, where this woman with the blood disorder touches Jesus' garments and she's made whole, there's that principle of transference in the text, and like produces like. She's made whole from Jesus's righteousness or from Jesus's purity. Also, you have this thing where in the ancient world, especially in Israel, in Judaism, a woman who was on her period was considered to be unclean, ritualistically unclean. When I say unclean, I don't mean physically, literally unclean like bacteria. They didn't know about bacteria. The reason why a woman on her period would be considered unclean was because in Israel, they considered blood to be unclean. Blood in some aspects was unclean. So somebody bleeding or somebody with a cut, they were unclean, and so they had to be excommunicated from the society until they got themselves together. So a woman who had a what's called a ritual impurity, who was on her period forever, she would have been excommunicated out of the group. And somebody who is ritualistically unclean, you could not touch them, because if you touch them, their impurity would transfer to you. Now, what we see with Jesus is different, because Jesus is touching people. Jesus is touching people who are unclean or impure, but their impureness is not making Jesus impure. It's Jesus's cleanness that is overpowering their impureness, and his cleanness is making them whole or making them heal. So that's really fascinating. That's what you see in the text. I could read that from my commentary, but I'd rather just spitball it because I want to kind of finish this video up. I don't want this video to be so long. We have this story in Matthew chapter 8. When he had, and this is talking about Jesus, Jesus is the subject. When he had entered Capernaum, a centurion came forward to him, appealing to him, Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, suffering terribly. And he said to him, I will come and heal him. But the centurion replied, Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I too, and look at what he's comparing Jesus' words to. For I too am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it. Remember, he said, but only say the word to Jesus, right? Remember what we just read in that Marduk story. When Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who followed him, truly I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such faith. I tell you, Many will come from the east to the west and recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And to the centurion, Jesus said, "Go, let it be done for you as you have believed." And the servant was healed at that very moment. So you have this idea in the text that Jesus's word is so powerful that by his word people can be made whole. And you see that idea in the Canaanite text where it is through Marduk's word that something can be made whole, that something can be destroyed, right? He spoke, and at his word, the garment was destroyed. He spoke again, and the garment reappeared. And remember, the reason why they think that is because if a human king could achieve almost all he wanted by the command, by no more than what seemed to be the words of his mouth, how much more possible for the immortal and superhuman deities in charge of the four realms of the universe? And you see, that is the mindset of the centurion. He understands that he himself has authority over an earthly kingdom and over earthly servants. So he realizes that Jesus has spiritual authority and spiritual power of a deity to command people to be healed and for people to be made whole and people to not be made whole, because like produces like. So this is what's going on in our biblical text. Jesus calming a storm. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. And other boats were there with him. And the great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, also on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" So you're starting to understand that they see that Jesus's word calms the sea. But there's another parallel to that as well. And you see that in Psalms 107:26 or 27. They reeled and staggered like drunken men and were at their wits' end. Then they cried to the Lord. I'm going to show you that that word, Lord, that actually isn't the word Lord. That actually in Psalms 107:27, that word Lord should be translated as, here we go. I think it was at 28. That word translated Lord, that word actually is the divine name Yahweh. I just had it. Here we go. Why did it do that? Here we go. Trying to pull it up so you guys can see exactly. I just had it up here. Yeah, this thing can be all over the place sometimes. I'm gonna pull it up one more time just so you guys can see. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble. It should be translated, then they cried to Yahweh. And that's important because in the ancient world, the only person who had control over the sea was God. Only God could control the sea. Only Yahweh could control the sea. Right? They reeled and staggered like drunken men and were at their wits' end. Then they cried to Yahweh in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. Then they were glad that the waters were quiet, and he brought them to their desired haven. The only person in Jewish thought that had control over the sea was Yahweh. And Jesus calms the sea in Mark 4:39. You can see that in their mind, the only person who can do things by the authority of their spoken word or utterance was God. That's why they put so much emphasis on, for example, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And you have this idea of God using his word or his utterance to create things in the same way that a king in the ancient world uses his word so that he can create and he can command his servants to do this and to do that. That is the context of what is happening. And so you see that Jesus is that divine word that God or Yahweh or the first power or God the Father uses to create the world. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And Jesus is the only person who can use his word or his utterance to control things and do things. So you see, it's a double entendre where Jesus has the authority to use his word so that he can create and do things, but at the same time, Jesus is that word. So it's a Jewish double entendre basically. And you see where the Israelites get this thought. You can see where the New Testament writers are pulling from. You can see where the Old Testament writers are pulling from. And you start to understand the cultural context of why people are doing what they're doing and how these miracles actually operate to a certain degree. So that is what I wanted to bring out. I wanted to show that because when we read these things from the ancient world, when we read that people were saying that Jesus was a magician, when we read that Jesus practiced magic arts, when we read even today from people like atheists saying, oh, that's just nonsense, Jesus did magic. When people say that as a tongue-in-cheek or as a term of disrespect, yes and no, but nowhere in the sense of what we mean today. When we say magic, we usually mean trickery or nonsense, but this was an entire serious study in the ancient world that actually had categories and subcategories. In all respects and purposes, magic in the ancient world to those people was a sort of technology. And I wouldn't just dismiss their magical claims without looking deeply into why they believed what they believed about what they believed. And when you look at your Bible from that perspective and you look at what's going on and you look at what's happening from an ancient Near Eastern perspective, things start to fall in line, things start to make more sense. And you can realize that these people were not just making this up, right? They weren't just lying. They weren't just writing this for no reason. This this Bible has a context, right? This Bible comes from a culture. This Bible comes from people, like I said, who live amongst other people. The Israelites don't live in a bubble, right? And when God is doing things and God is operating in the supernatural world, there's a method to the madness. So, was Jesus actually a magician? In all respects and purposes, in today's terms, no. Uh, Jesus definitely, in a sense, like I said, it would depend on what you meant by magic. But Jesus definitely did not use the power of demons so that he could do his miracles. Jesus definitely used the power of God, but not in the same sense that we think today in our terms in 2022. It's a little bit more complicated. It's a little bit more fleshed out. But the conclusions that we have about Jesus definitely is God. Jesus definitely is the Son of God. Jesus definitely was a miracle worker. But when you start to peel these ancient layers back, you start to understand this in a whole new light. And hopefully, this strengthens your faith in Jesus as Messiah, Jesus as Yahweh, Jesus as God. Because a lot of times, also, too, people look into this ancient culture, and if you don't have a firm foundation in who Jesus is, then this stuff definitely will mess you up. So you have to first understand that yes, Jesus is God, Jesus is the Son of God. I definitely will hold to like the Nicene Creed, the church councils, as far as the divinity of Jesus and the essence of God, and work backwards from there. If you don't have that firm foundation that Jesus is God and Jesus is God's Son, and definitely the Trinity. I know a lot of people don't like the Trinity. You have to watch my other videos where I break that down and I explain that. If you don't, if you don't work backwards from a church council Trinitarian mindset and work backwards from there and then work your way back up again, you more than likely are going to look at this stuff and it's not going to make sense, or you're going to come to the wrong conclusion. So don't turn your back on the church councils. Don't turn your back on the different church creeds about the divinity and the essence of Jesus. You definitely don't want to step into heresy, but you do want to add more layers to what you believe and figure out why the ancient writers believed what they believe, so that you can get a full holistic picture of your Bible. So I definitely would recommend people like Dr. John Walton, Craig Keener, definitely. That cultural study Bible I have is really, really helpful. I definitely would recommend people like Michael Heiser. Michael Heiser is great. However, Heiser doesn't really dive deep into this stuff as deeply as like Craig Keener. Heiser is really great if you have friends who are in Christian fundamentalism. Heiser is really great for introducing this material in a way that a fundamentalist or a lay person can understand. But you don't want to stay with Heiser. You want to dive a little bit more into this stuff so that you can understand the stuff more. Definitely my YouTube channel is a big help. And you want to read papers on this stuff. You want to get to the point where you can actually read academic papers and you can have enough discernment on what is good scholarship and what isn't. You can read a lot of this material, and you don't have to accept the conclusions of the material too. If the material is telling you that Jesus isn't God and that Jesus is a lie and stuff like that, obviously wisdom would tell you that's not true. But as you dive more into the material and things like that, things will definitely make more sense. So I hope I was able to give some good context, and I hope that now we can understand that when the Bible describes Jesus' miracles, we don't have to look at that from a scientific perspective or a scientific lens. It already has a lens in which it can be looked at. And when you understand the cultural lens that they're coming from, it makes a whole lot more sense than what we're looking at today. So on that note, I'm going to end this video. It's already been an hour and 4 minutes. And share this video around. Definitely share this information around. Only about, I would say, 0.1% of people even know this material. It's old. It's really, really old material per se. We just figured this out in like the 1800s. Scholars have been talking about this stuff since the 1800s, 1900s. And normal everyday lay people don't even know this stuff is around. They don't even know this stuff exists. So if you're blessed by this material and this material brought you closer to God, it brought you closer to a better understanding of Jesus, share this material around. You will not find any material like this on YouTube, on the internet per se. And I hope I was able to be a blessing for you guys. Until next time, don't forget to subscribe. Definitely subscribe. Hit that notification bell. And until next time, good luck and good night.